Chapter 1426. The reinforcements in Gray's mind were indeed on their way here. However, not long after they left Samara City, they were surrounded by the commander of the new Second Army, Shibi, who had suddenly appeared along a tributary of the Volga River. The 1st Regiment commander of the 2nd Cold Front Division, Chai Ji, was also with him. The sound of a gun was exchanged for 10,000 taels of gold. In just an hour, 5,000 reinforcements and 100 carriages of rations were exchanged for the 5th Star Army's contribution. Reporting to the commander. We have killed more than 870 enemies and captured the rest. Not a single one escaped. Please report. The commander of the guards, Su Liang, reported the results of the battle in a loud voice. Quickly clean up the battlefield. Do not leave behind any traces of battle. Shibi returned the salute and gave the order. Then he smiled at Chai Ji and asked, Commander Chai, why do you look so down? Yes. These opponents are too weak. It's not fun to fight them. Chai Ji sighed and pretended to be a fool. At this moment, he looked as if he had taken advantage of the situation and was pretending to be innocent. After listening to him, Shibi did not expose him. Instead, he pretended to be deep in thought and said, Since that's the case, the next time the Mongolian army sends reinforcements, let us, the new Second Army, deal with them. If there are people who try to escape, you can attack them. Chai Ji jumped up like a rabbit whose tail had been stepped on. How is that possible? The 6th young master said that the Cold Front Division should be the main force in the battle. Only then can we eliminate the enemy faster and more thoroughly. How can we, his subordinates, change the order? Oh. Then we will have to trouble Commander Chai. Shibi smiled bitterly. Yang Qindong's order was like this, but it was just an excuse. In short, the Cold Front Division should be the first to fight. If there were any problems, the new Second Army could only get the leftovers. But in the face of the tyrannical advantage of firearms, how could there be any problems? Just as Shibi and Chai Ji were lamenting that the enemy was too weak and that the battle was not challenging at all. Further south, the Reconnaissance Division commander Su Yunxing was leading a small group of cavalry on a patrol. Su Yunxing entered the Golden Horde with the 2nd Division of the Cold Front and the transport team. After coming here, Yang Qindong gave him a new order, which was to go to the front lines and completely seal off the battle below Kazan. In other words, not a single Mongolian scout was allowed to enter the battlefield. This would create a sense of mystery and prevent the Golden Horde from acting rashly because they did not know what was going on. In Yang Qindong's eyes, the final battle would take place next year. What he needed to do this year was to stabilize the rear. As the old saying goes, to resist foreign aggression, one must first stabilize the internal situation. Naturally, he would not be at ease if such a difficult mission was given to others. Even the most elite Lung Feng could not guarantee that no one would escape and that there would be no problems. However, it was a completely different story when it was handed over to Su Yunxing, the Recon Division commander. When it came to scouting, there were very few people in Xianxia's 5-star army that were his match. Thus, he could rest assured that the mission would be given to him. After Su Yunxing received the order, he split the 3,000 cavalry scouts into 30 squadrons and 300 squads to spread out. His request was to control the entire defensive line from Asala to Kazan. He wanted to ensure that every forest, every river and every mountain was under surveillance. The scouts were mobilized. The mission they received was difficult and not easy to carry out. After all, there were too few of them and the area was too big. However, after being divided into 300 squads, they still managed to do it. From the start of the mission until now, they had secretly killed more than 100 Mongolian scouts and completely controlled the area. Not everyone could be a good scout. Normally, it would be difficult to find one qualified scout out of 100 Mongolian cavalrymen. This time, more than 100 of them were wiped out. No matter how strong the Golden Horde was, it was enough to cause them serious damage and make them suffer a lot. Division Commander, the soldiers have achieved a lot in the past 3 days. I think the Inner Mongolian army will not be able to send any more scouts to gather information in the near future. Yenda, who had been promoted from battalion commander to regiment commander, said with a smile. His face was filled with excitement and pride. Don't be careless. Before we receive the order to retreat, let the soldiers keep their eyes open. This is a military order from the 6th young master. We can't be careless and we can't ruin the reputation of our scouts, Su Yunxing replied with a serious expression. It was all thanks to Yang Qindong that he could have today. This time it was the order of the sixth young master himself. He would never have the slightest bit of carelessness. Yenda's expression turned serious. Division Commander, please do not worry. Your subordinate will pass on this order now. The scouts were unable to find out the exact situation of the battle. Another batch of reinforcements arrived and was dealt with. In the short span of 3 days, 2 batches of 10,000 reinforcements were surrounded and captured alive. Just the number of captives was close to 8,000. At this point, Gray's troops were completely isolated. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. There was no change in the situation. The food in the army had basically been depleted. At this moment, it was not an exaggeration to say that he had run out of food and ammunition. In just 3 days, the morale of the army had fallen to the extreme. Many soldiers were unwilling to get up in order to reduce the consumption of energy. They did not look like soldiers and did not have the morale to fight. This made him very angry. He was also very helpless. Should he charge? The 2 failures had already told him that the Han people were very powerful. Charging was just suicide. Should he retreat? Their path of retreat was blocked. Without the cooperation of reinforcements, how could they charge out? Should he surrender? As a general of the Golden Horde, his dignity did not allow him to do so. At this moment he did not know what to do. The most terrible thing in a war was to wander around without a purpose. That would only waste time and create opportunities for the enemy to destroy you. After all, Gray was one of the top generals in the Golden Horde. He would never have thought of making such a low-level mistake, but he was making it now. Without a goal in mind, waiting to die was the only thing Gray could do at this moment, as well as the only thing he could do. He looked around and found that the Han people's camp had not changed at all. In the past 3 days there had not been a single opening. If he continued to wait, there might not be any good opportunities. Since he could not wait for the enemy to make a mistake, he could only take the initiative to attack. Without anyone to cooperate with, he could only rely on himself to kill his way out. No matter what, he was the second-ranked general of the Golden Horde. He had a resolute heart. Gray's target was the southeast side behind him. He had already observed that there were only about 20,000 Han people there. He still had 30,000 elite cavalry and 30,000 White Russian slaves. When the time came, he would leave 20,000 White Russian slaves to guard his back while the 10,000 White Russian slaves charged forward. Once they got close to the Han army, he would lead the cavalry to break through the encirclement. He did not ask for victory in this battle, nor did he ask for the number of enemies he could kill. As long as he could charge out, it would be a victory. With such low requirements, there should be a chance for him to do it. Men, distribute the rations and prepare for battle. Gray was very smart. He used the Han people's military tactics to fight to survive. Without enough rations, everyone could not continue to wait. The only path left was to fight with their lives on the line. Kazan City. Every move of the Mongolian army would be reported to Yang Chendong at any time. When he heard that the other side had started to distribute the rations, Yang Chendong, who was writing a development plan with his head lowered, slowly raised his head. His eyes flashed with a light of wisdom. Are they preparing for a counterattack? It's been 3 days. They should be unable to hold themselves back. Gray did not know that his every move had been seen clearly by Yang Chendong. Even if he knew, he would not care. He had summoned several captains and kiliarchs of the army, and was cheering them on. Everyone, the might of the 5-star army's firearms is extremely strong. They are many times stronger than the White Russian army. This kind of enemy is not something we can deal with. Therefore I have decided to break out of the encirclement. As long as we can escape, it will be a great victory. We can then report the situation of the 5-star army to the Khan. In the future we should not be impulsive and take the initiative to find trouble. Defending our own city is the best choice. After all, it has been proven that the other side only has firearms and no cannons. This is the only thing we can rejoice about. Bang! Bang! It seemed to be a slap in the face. Just as Gray finished speaking, the roar of the cannons rang out, causing the faces of the generals present to turn ugly. There was no need to talk about Gray. His eyes were so red that they could be compared to a monkey's butt. At this moment he finally understood that it was not that the other side did not have cannons. It was just that the time was not right. Just by listening to the sound of the cannons, he knew that the other side's cannons were as powerful as their firearms. The 100mm mortar started to wreak havoc in the Mongol cavalry camp. Under the command of the 2nd Division Artillery Battalion Commander Lin Luan, a total of 20 cannons landed one after another beside the camp. When the first cannonball landed, it caused a huge wave that was enough to blow over the camp and cause the neighs of war horses to ring out continuously. Although it was only a total of 60 cannonballs, it was enough to cause a huge wave, causing Gray, who was preparing to break out of the encirclement, to be completely defeated. What's going on? Where did the cannons come from? Where did the cannons come from? Gray walked out of the large tent and grabbed a Mongol soldier who was running around in panic. It's the cannons from Kazan City. That soldier originally wanted to break free from his restraints. He did not want to die and only wanted to find a safe place to hide. However, when he saw that the person who stopped him was General Gray, he had no choice but to stand on the spot and answer. The cannons from the city? That's impossible. After hearing this answer, Gray shook his head continuously. That was a distance of 8 li. He did not believe that any cannons could reach that far. Furthermore, the cannons were not solid shells but explosive shells. All of this had already exceeded his understanding. Chapter 1427. Regardless of whether he wanted to admit it or not, the moment the cannons stopped firing, all sorts of information had been sent over by the army, confirming that the Han soldiers had fired from the city walls. Upon hearing this, Gray's face turned deathly pale. How could he possibly contend against an opponent that possessed a firearm that could fire continuously and a cannon that could fire from such a long distance? Gray did not believe that the reason why the cannon did not land in the center of the camp was because the Han soldiers were not accurate enough. This was clearly an attempt by the other party to intimidate him. There was only one reason for doing so, and that was to subdue him. Surrender? That's impossible. Although Gray had already lost most of his fighting spirit as a general of the Golden Horde, his pride would not allow him to easily lower his head. After the cannons fired, the morale of the Mongolian soldiers, who had just eaten their last rations, fell to the bottom once again. Facing such a powerful opponent that they could not even see, how were they supposed to fight this battle? Just as the morale of the entire army was at its lowest and the soldiers were in a state of panic, the call for surrender finally rang out. Loud voices rang out as the soldiers of the 5-star army surrounded the 50,000-strong Mongolian camp, shouting the slogan, "Surrender and live. Those who resist will die." These words were shouted out in Mandarin, Mongolian and Russian, ensuring that the surrounded enemies could hear them clearly. As the calls for surrender rang out, the entire camp seemed to have exploded with different reactions from the soldiers. After witnessing the powerful firepower of the 5-star army, many of the soldiers had already felt powerless. Furthermore, they had already run out of rations, so even if they wanted to persist, they did not have the confidence to do so. Thus, some of the soldiers had a bold idea of surrendering to the Han soldiers. As the saying goes, a bad life is better than a good death, right? Furthermore, the Han soldiers possessed such powerful firearms, surrendering to them was not a shameful matter. Gray noticed the changes in the expressions of the soldiers, causing him to feel extremely anxious. He knew that the situation was developing towards the worst possible outcome. If he was unable to think of a solution in a short period of time, the 50,000-strong army might really have to surrender to the Han soldiers. Reinforcements? Where exactly are the reinforcements? Gray placed his last hope on the reinforcements. He didn't believe that the Khan would give up on him. Then why hadn't the army transporting the rations arrived yet? He arranged for his personal guards to keep an eye on the rear. As long as he saw a trace of chaos in the 5-star army, he would have the confidence to charge out and meet up with the reinforcements. As the sky gradually darkened, Gray, who was still persevering, did not give the order to surrender. The soldiers below could only endure hugging their weapons and curling up together. Since they had already confirmed that there was no dinner, they could only move less to reduce their energy consumption. However, he neglected one thing, and that was the hearts of the soldiers. During the day, due to the strict supervision as well as the fact that Gray had sent out his personal guards to patrol the area, no one dared to escape in front of them. However, it was different when it was dark. The limited vision caused many gaps to appear in the barracks. This gave some soldiers who were ready to surrender a chance to survive. The sky had just turned dark and a team of 100 people had already surrendered. When the news reached Gray's ears, he remained silent. After a while he replied, "Got it." With the situation as such, It wasn't something that could be changed by human strength. In the end, Gray was still soft-hearted. He didn't want to see all of his soldiers die here like him. Why not be merciful before they die and give them a chance to live? The general's disregard for everything sped up the process of the Mongol army surrendering. At the start, it was only 100 men surrendering. Under the threat of the powerful guns and cannons, it was 1,000 men surrendering one by one. No one even bothered to look after the White Russian slaves. In the end, during the chaos, the Mongol soldiers and White Russian slaves surrendered to the Five-Star Army. Division Commander Xiao Feng's mission was to guard the rear of the Mongol cavalry. According to the plan, this was likely to be the place where the battle was the most intense. After all, once they discovered that the road ahead was blocked, the Mongol army that wanted to escape would definitely charge towards this place. The plan couldn't keep up with the changes. The Mongol army, which still had over 50,000 soldiers, had actually surrendered just like that. This caused all of Xiao Feng's preparations to be useless. He could only lead his soldiers to capture captives. For the entire night, no one was able to find a chance to rest. When the sun rose, the entire Mongol camp was already empty. When General Gray walked out of his tent, he saw less than 2,000 soldiers. It wasn't that these people didn't want to escape, but that they had killed too many people. They were afraid that even if they surrendered, they wouldn't be able to survive. Okay. Looking at the remaining 2,000 cavalrymen, Gray started to relax. He could finally go all out without any misgivings. Everyone. Centaurs. Outside the camp, Division Commander Xiao Feng didn't reveal any signs of exhaustion after a night of hard work. On the contrary, he was extremely excited. After his continuous requests, Yang Qindong finally handed over the task of dealing with the remaining 2,000 Mongol cavalry soldiers to him. Although their numbers were slightly less, they could still put up a good fight. Early in the morning, Xiao Feng had gathered a few thousand soldiers and surrounded the Mongol camp. Now all they had to do was wait for the enemy to charge out so that they could deal with the problem in one go. After the formation was set up, the Mongol cavalry soldiers walked out of the camp as expected. Although there were less than 2,000 cavalry soldiers left, they were all prepared to die, causing them to appear exceptionally imposing. Immediately put down your weapons and surrender. If not, don't blame us for being impolite. Division Commander Xiao Feng finally had the chance to shout out. His shout wasn't soft, but there was another voice that resounded in Xiao Feng's heart. You must not surrender. You must not surrender. If not, with such a large formation there won't be a battle to fight. Xiao Feng was worried that these 2,000 soldiers would still choose to surrender. However, his worries were clearly unnecessary. Since these people didn't choose to surrender last night, why would they do so now? Facing the ice-cold muzzles of the Mongol cavalry soldiers, all of them pulled out their cavalry swords. Under General Gray's furious roar, they started a suicidal charge. Iron hooves stomped on the ground, causing dust to rise. One after another, the Mongol cavalry soldiers shouted loudly, waving their cavalry swords as they charged forward. What welcomed them was Division Commander Xiao Feng's command. Following which, gunshots rang out. Bullets whizzed through the air, piercing through the bodies of the charging cavalry soldiers. Blood splattered everywhere. One after another, the Mongol cavalry soldiers fell on the path of the charge. The Mongol cavalry soldiers were already prepared. Almost every one of them was shot in the chest. Their cavalry swords fell from their hands, and their corpses fell from their horses like dumplings. Gray took the lead, carrying out the duties of a general as he charged at the very front. Although he didn't turn his head, his senses told him that soldiers were falling beside him. Very quickly, there were no other noises around him. When he was 50 meters away from the Mongol cavalry soldiers, his surroundings became extremely quiet. He finally couldn't help but turn his head around. All he saw was a ground full of corpses, and the war horses that no one was commanding were whining on the spot. Reality told him that everyone had died in battle except for himself. This was enough to prove that the Mongol cavalry soldiers' marksmanship had reached a level where they could hit wherever they wanted. If not, why was he the only one left alive? Why? When he saw that he was the only one left alive, Gray was on the verge of breaking down. This was the outcome he didn't want to see the most. He wanted to die like a brave warrior, but these Han people didn't give him such a chance. As Gray shouted, two sturdy horses appeared in front of him. One of them was holding a sharp divine saber, while the other was holding a rather heavy mace. They blocked Gray's path of advance, one on the left and one on the right. The people who had come were Beta Persei and Ahuli. The former had only been allowed to enter the battlefield after continuously begging Yang Chendong. As for Ahuli, Yang Chendong cherished talent. He had already found out from the captives that everyone had surrendered because Gray had tacitly agreed to it. This was enough to prove that Gray was still kind. He liked such people very much and was willing to recruit them. Ahuli's mission was to persuade Gray to work for him. When Gray saw the two warriors, he couldn't help but stop his horse. He wanted to see what the other party wanted to say to him. "You must be General Gray. My young master already knows what you've done. He admires you very much. Now I'll give you a chance. Dismount and surrender. Not only will you not die, but if you perform well enough, you can also lead soldiers and become a general again. Of course, this so-called performance means that you have to defeat me. Do you dare?" Beta Persei stretched out his left hand and gently stroked the cavalry sword in his hand. An eager expression appeared on his face. He didn't ask if he could, but if he dared. This was originally a verbal trap. However, Gray was clearly infuriated by young heir's words. He had lost, but he had lost to the powerful guns and cannons, not because he was afraid of the two-legged Han people. Seeing that Beta Persei had challenged him on behalf of the Han people, Gray, who had long been suppressing his anger and wanted to prove himself, immediately shouted back, "Who's afraid is a coward? Just don't let others help you with guns." Beta Persei was afraid that Gray wouldn't agree. As long as he was given a chance to fight, why would he need the help of others? Did he really think that he was playing around with Yang Chendong these days? With a grandmaster by his side, his improvement was obvious. Although he could often fight with the Black Cavalry, it was not a life-and-death battle, so he couldn't completely let go. Now that the opportunity had appeared, he laughed and said, "Okay, it'll be a one-on-one fight between the two of us. Ahuli, you don't have to help." Chapter 1428. Ahuli, who had been called out, was already prepared to step in once Beta Persei was no match for him. This person was Bugnam of Gojoseon's personal guard and was the most trusted person. Nothing must happen to him, especially in front of Ahuli. But he never thought that Beta Persei would call out his name. This left him at a loss for what to do for a moment. Before Ahuli could think of what to do next, Beta Persei had already urged his horse to rush out. Gray, who was opposite him, also shouted and rushed over on his horse. If it was a battle on land, there was almost no suspense. Beta Persei could always be by Yang Chendong's side, so how could his skills be bad? But this was a battle on horseback. Not only did it depend on who was braver and stronger, it also depended on who was more skilled in horsemanship. Why had the Central Plains, who seemed to be quite strong, always been unable to defeat the people of the grasslands? Was it because they were not brave? Of course, the answer was not like that. There was a certain gap between the two sides, and the difference was in the control of horsemanship. I didn't just call them a people on horseback. Many times, cavalry and warhorses had long been integrated into one. Some warhorses with intelligence could even analyze what to do next based on their master's mood. In contrast, the Han people rode horses to prepare for war. They had a short time of training, and their tacit understanding with their warhorses was far inferior to that of the Mongolian knights. This made the other party's cavalry unstoppable. The Han people would always be defeated again and again. In the end, they could only passively defend. Ahuli, who knew this well, couldn't help but worry about Beta Persei. At the same time, he stared nervously at the battlefield. Even if he had to disobey the military order, he had to rush forward to save Beta Persei when he was in trouble. Gray, who was in the middle of the battlefield, had no time to think about other things. Beta Persei had already rushed towards him on his warhorse with a saber in hand. Just from the other party's riding posture and the way he held his saber, he had a feeling that this Han person was much stronger than he had imagined. There was a smile on his face, and if one looked closely, it was caused by excitement. Ever since he was a child, Beta Persei had been a great admirer of heroes, especially since Yang Chendong created the industry of storytelling. Beta Persei would often visit Yang Chendong when he was off work, and he had heard of countless heroic deeds. For example, Guan Yu beheading Hua Xiong with warm wine, the three heroes' battle against Lu Bu, and so on. More than once he had thought that one day he would be like the hero in those books and then become famous throughout the world. The wife of Ba Daojiang, the vice-captain of the Black Cavalry 1st Platoon, was the head of the publicity department. As long as what he said was the truth, she would be able to create a drama based on him. If that was the case, wouldn't he be famous all over the world? Even if it was for the sake of becoming famous and becoming a hero, Beta Persei had to perform well. He brought out 120% of his spirit. When he faced Gray, there was no fear or dread in his eyes, only excitement and agitation. "Watch my blade." Borrowing the horse's momentum, he quickly rushed in front of Gray. Then he slashed down with his blade. He used 100% of his strength in this slash. Gray didn't know about this. In his opinion, the outcome of the battle between the two of them couldn't be determined in a short period of time. This meant that he had to save his strength. At the very least, he couldn't use it all at once. Otherwise, how could he continue to play? Instinctively, he only used 60% of his strength to block this slash. He was even prepared to counterattack after blocking the attack. However, when the two sabers collided with the scimitar, he knew that he was wrong, very wrong. Oh my God. Instinctively, Gray, who had let out a sigh, couldn't help but feel his right arm being pressed down. At this moment, he felt that his right arm had been injured with just one blow. What was worse was that the saber was still transmitting a huge amount of force, forcing his saber to move back bit by bit. His face was red. At this moment, Gray wanted to continue increasing his strength to turn the situation around. However, in a situation where he was already suppressed, it was very difficult to turn the situation around. Furthermore, his opponent didn't seem to be giving him the time to do so. Beta Persei was a hothead. In his eyes, there were no rules of a one-on-one fight. In his opinion, a move that could knock down his opponent was a good move. Just like what the young master always said, no matter if it was a black cat or a white cat, it was a good cat if it could catch a mouse. As for gaining the upper hand in just one round, this was somewhat out of Beta Persei's expectations. He had always heard people say how good the Mongolian cavalry was on horseback, how exquisite the Mongolian general's equestrian skills were, and how outstanding his strength was. He was even prepared for a bitter battle. However, he didn't expect to completely suppress his opponent in just one round. He felt that the strength of his opponent's arm was much weaker than he had imagined. Thus, he had to take advantage of the situation and say, "Oh, this strength isn't that great either?" It would have been better if he didn't say anything. After hearing this, Gray's expression turned ugly. His face, which was originally red from holding his breath, became even redder. It was as if he was about to turn completely red. At this moment, he wanted to angrily scold his opponent for not following the rules. Why did he have to use his full strength right from the start? However, he didn't have the chance to speak at all. The two scimitars, one up and one down, were still rapidly approaching Gray's chest. No matter how hard Gray tried, it was already impossible for him to turn the situation around. In just a short while, he felt his entire right arm go numb and sore. If not for his willpower supporting him, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to hold on anymore. Beta Persei, who had the upper hand, was continuously exerting his strength. Seeing that the situation was set, he even saw that a crack had appeared on his opponent's scimitar because of the continuous attacks. He was afraid that if he continued to persevere, he wouldn't have to do anything. The strength of his scimitar would be enough to guarantee victory. Thus, he slightly restrained his strength. Then his body slanted and he took the opportunity to kick forward. Beta Persei was very clear in his heart that the young master wanted a living Mongolian general, not a dead one. Otherwise, why would he need to put in so much effort? A single bullet would be enough to end the battle. The kick came without any warning, causing a hint of joy to appear on Gray's face. He thought that his opponent was powerless and was about to withdraw his scimitar. Just as he was about to counterattack, a large foot appeared in front of his eyes. Then the foot grew bigger and bigger until he felt a sudden pain in his chest. Beta Persei's strength was so great that this kick made Gray feel as if he couldn't breathe. Then he fell from his horse and a sharp saber was placed on his neck. Originally, they thought that it would be a fierce battle. However, who would have thought that it would end so anticlimactically? Many people didn't have the time to watch it before it ended. Gray had become a captive under the saber. There was no need for Beta Persei to say anything. The other 5-star army soldiers had already run over and tied up Gray, who had fallen to the ground. With him tied up, it also meant that the Mongolian army had suffered a great defeat. A total of 80,000 people came. After this battle, the number of captives reached 60,000. Haha, this Kagan of the Golden Horde is a little like a transport captain. After Yang Qindong finished speaking, he didn't care if anyone else understood him. He turned around and went down the city gate tower. Just yesterday he received a telegram from the world's 1st Cavalry Army and the Cold Front's 3rd Cavalry Army. It recorded that they had defeated Turgenev of the Russian clan. Turgenev had underestimated his opponent and rashly attacked. The Cold Front's 2nd Cavalry Division had sent reinforcements and made him dizzy. Then the world's 1st Cavalry Army took the opportunity to attack and ended the battle. Yang Qindong had already expected this result. Turgenev wasn't a direct descendant of the Russian duchy. Furthermore, he had underestimated his opponent and sent out his troops against the Cold Front and the world's 1st Cavalry Army. It would be strange if he didn't lose. The only regret was that Turgenev had escaped. No one would have thought that when the world's 1st Cavalry Army launched their attack, Turgenev would be one of the first to escape. This caused the morale of the Mongolian army to plummet. At the same time, it also allowed the general to escape the net. Perhaps the Cold Front's 2nd Cavalry Division and the world's 1st Cavalry Army had fought too fiercely. In the end, only 70,000 of the 100,000 enemies had escaped. Only 30,000 had been killed or captured. Since the battle had been decided, the next thing he had to think about was how to revive the country. He had to turn this place into an important Xianxia military base in the shortest time possible. 7 days had passed and there was still no news about the attack on Kazan City. Mahamar's intuition told him that things weren't going well. What's going on? Send someone to investigate. This Khan doesn't believe that 80,000 people can fly to the sky. If they're alive, I want to see them. If they're dead, I want to see their corpses. With a face full of dissatisfaction, Mahamar called over his subordinate General Bodo, who was in charge of scouting and intelligence. Yes, your humble servant will immediately investigate. Bodo was sweating profusely. A total of 50,000 elite cavalrymen and 30,000 White Russian slaves had disappeared not long after leaving Samara City. Not only that, but the 3 transport brigades that he had sent out, a total of 15,000 people, had also disappeared. There were also more than 200 elite scouts that he had sent out. They had all disappeared. That was more than 200 elite scouts, and he had invested a lot of effort into them. Now that there was no news, he didn't even dare to tell the Khan. He was afraid that he would have to bear the responsibility in the end. Bodo quickly turned around and left. What he didn't know was that the nightmare would continue. With Commander Su Yunxing leading 3,000 elite cavalry scouts, no matter how many scouts he sent out, they would all be like meat buns thrown to a dog, never to return. They won in one battle and it was an easy victory. All the soldiers who had experienced this scene, especially the Mongol and White Russian soldiers who had just joined, were full of admiration for the 5-star army. They didn't need anyone to tell them what to do next, and they all focused on training. Chapter 1429. Interest was the best teacher. When there was motivation, the enthusiasm of the soldiers increased. As the instructors, the skeleton warriors of the 5-star army felt much more relaxed. When the matter was reported to Yang Qindong, he didn't care about it anymore. He had already focused on the road construction. This place was too far away from the 5-star army's base camp. Even if it was relatively close to the 3 eastern provinces and Xianxia, it would still take 1 or 2 months to travel. Such a long transportation line made Yang Qindong worried. He couldn't watch a large number of supplies being consumed on the road. Although Xianxia was developing fast and had enough wealth to persist, if he didn't think of a solution, it would eventually become a problem. It might become a fatal problem at any time. In order to save time on the road, Yang Qindong thought of the steam train. It had been more than 2 months since the first steam engine was built in Rezin City. Many things were difficult in the beginning and difficult in the first step. As long as the first step was taken well, many things would become much easier in the future. According to the telegram, the number of steam engines in Rezin City had already exceeded 5,000, and the number would increase exponentially every month. The fields involved included mining, water pumping, agriculture, textiles, construction of field cannons, and so on. Following the continuous research and development, it would also involve the power drive, such as the use of warships and the real construction of trains. Over the years, the research department of Crimson City had been working hard on the exploration. They had even created electric batteries, and they had also built electric scooters according to the ideas provided by Yang Chendong. Although they could only build two-wheeled motorcycles and three-wheeled motorcycles due to the limitations of their efficiency, they could still build two. As long as they had the right ideas, it wouldn't be difficult to build electric scooters in the near future. Even so, with the steam engine, would the steam train be far away? Once there was a train, it would greatly increase the speed of the five-star army's march and Xianxia's commercial and industrial development. At that time, with the fastest speed, they could achieve twice the result with half the effort. Yang Chendong was confident that this day wouldn't be too far away. What he needed to do now was to make all the necessary preparations. For example, the provinces of Laos, Vietnam and Cambodia had already begun to lay down railway tracks in preparation for the appearance and operation of trains. Even the origin city had begun to study this matter. It was said that they were preparing for the project. As their leader, Yang Chendong naturally couldn't be left behind. First, he had to build the road and lay a good foundation. This was what he was prepared to do this winter. Once there was a good foundation, the rails could be laid as soon as they were in place. Would the steam train be far away? At that time, the local specialties here could be easily transported out in the shortest time. The thought of the profits made Yang Chendong smile in his sleep. After setting the plan, Yang Chendong gave the order and began to get busy. The White Russians and Mongolian captives were the main force, while the rest were invited over with money and food. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the situation changed every day. In just the first day, these people cleared the mountains, built bridges and built a solid foundation of 3 kilometers. Don't underestimate these 3 kilometers. Many of them were doing this for the first time and didn't know where to start. As they became more familiar with it, they could even reach 30 kilometers a day or even longer. At this time, Yang Chendong seemed to be able to see the scene of a steam train burning coal and water roaming the land. Compared to the bustling construction scene in the east of Yangqin, the world's first cavalry army was recuperating and training in Oxino City. Not everyone was like Yang Chendong. They could create many things that were much more advanced than the modern era. Take Tianhu for example. All he could do was train his elite troops and win battles. After meeting up with Wu Sheng's Third Army, they unexpectedly went north and occupied Oxino City in order to find a place to rest and recuperate. Wu Sheng's Third Army was basically destroyed this time, and their fighting strength was less than 20%. They would need at least half a year to recover to a certain extent. In comparison, the world's #1 cavalry army did not need to do so. They had won the battle with the White Russians almost immediately and had not suffered any losses. While Commander Tianhu was resting, he began to lead the cavalry of the First Army to the nearby areas to gather grass and grains. What Tianhu did not expect was that although there were many White Russian villages in the surrounding area, they were simply too poor. It was to the point that many people had problems even eating. When he led the army to places, they did not encounter any resistance. Afterwards, countless people brought their families and surrendered. In order to survive, they even took out the only food they had. In Tianhu's eyes, the amount of food they had made him not know whether to laugh or cry. Originally, he wanted to make a profit, but he did not expect that the nearby White Russians were even poorer than him. In desperation, Tianhu could only give up on robbing the people. However, what he did not expect was that he would gain the title of a benevolent and righteous army. It turned out that the bloodlines of these White Russians were not the purest. Their bloodlines were not only White Russians but also Mongols and other white races. Because of this, the blind Duke and the other White Russians who believed themselves to be pure did not approve of them and even began to abandon them. Only when they lacked food would they occasionally think of them and rob them. They were originally poor, and after being robbed again and again, these impure White Russians only became poorer. There were even cases of them trading children for food. But even so, they were still struggling to survive. This was also one of the reasons why when Tianhu appeared with the army, they instinctively offered up their food in order to survive. After getting used to being robbed, when they suddenly saw that the Han army did not want anything, the people were moved and became more willing. Many of them actually followed Tianhu's army back to Oxino City. This was all because they were filled with envy when they saw that the #1 cavalry army in the world could eat steamed buns and even meat intestines. It was to the point that they were willing to risk danger to follow Tianhu's army, all for the sake of being able to eat their fill. Tianhu also had a headache about these people following him, So he quickly sent a telegram to Yang Qindong to ask for instructions on how to solve this problem. And there was a reply. Yang Qindong ordered that in view of the heavy losses suffered by the Third Army, they could consider recruiting young and strong soldiers from the people on the spot. As for the other people, they could be arranged to build roads from Oxino City to Bulgar City. Later there would be a logistics team transporting food and fodder there. Whether it was the Golden Horde or the Rossi Principalities, in Yang Qindong's eyes, the most valuable thing was people. This place was vast and sparsely populated, and people were the foundation of all things. As long as there was enough labor for him to use, whether it was mining or obtaining other information, the speed would be much faster. He had already sent a telegram to Achaemen City, requesting for a few mining teams. However, the number of people was limited and some of the basic labor needed people to do. Population was extremely important. After receiving the order, Tianhu followed the instructions in the telegram and recruited the people into the city. He assigned them jobs according to their age and also provided them with food. He also promised that if they performed well, they would be paid more and the amount would not be too little. As long as they were willing to work hard, the money they earned would not only be able to feed their families, but also improve their quality of life. Being paid for work was a matter of course. How could they work without physical strength? Even so, the food was only 30% full and they would not starve to death, not to mention being paid for their work. When had the people here ever heard of such a good life? Soon more and more people were heading to Oxino City. Many people who lived far away also came in droves when they heard the news. Although they did not know whether this was true or not, it still gave them hope for survival. Although many of them had opened up some fertile land nearby to survive, every time it was time to harvest, the White Russians would come out to plunder. Often, a year's worth of hard work would be for nothing. Now that they could enter the city to work, their safety was guaranteed. As for whether they would be paid or not, they did not dare to ask for too much. At the very least, they would be provided with food. The number of people coming to seek refuge increased day by day. Tianhu and Wuxia were naturally overjoyed. They quickly sent out a large number of people to maintain law and order. At the same time, they formed a temporary department in charge of settling the people. For a time the city was very lively. Some people were happy while others were worried. When the news spread to the Rossi Principalities and the White Russian nobles, they could not remain calm. These people were not pure White Russians. In their eyes, they were the lowest existences. They were targets that could be taken as they wished. They looked down on such people in their hearts and did not treat them as their own. However, if someone wanted to snatch people from them, they would not allow it. What's wrong? I can bully my people and I can even slaughter them. But outsiders are absolutely not allowed. Otherwise, when I need food and labor in the future, where will they go to find them? If the entire country's people followed suit and asked for food and wages just to work for them, wouldn't they go bankrupt? The nobles were not willing, and the matter was quickly reported to the Grand Duke of Blindness. They begged the Grand Duke to uphold justice for them. Under great pressure, the Grand Duke of Blindness had no choice but to change his previous strategy and consider sending troops to the Five-Star Army. Spies had already reported that the Five-Star Army had conquered 4 cities of the Golden Horde. Not only that, but they also fought a big battle outside Kazan City. As for the results, there was still no news. Even the scouts of the Golden Horde could not get any specific information, let alone the weaker Rossi Principalities. Chapter 1430. But no matter what, it was always a good thing for these two opponents to fight. According to the Grand Duke of Blindness's strategy, what they needed to do was to watch the two tigers fight and let them suffer. Then when they were tired of fighting, they would quickly attack and secure victory. But now what happened in Oxino City had crossed their bottom line. It was unrealistic to want to watch the battle. Summoning a group of generals and nobles, the Grand Duke of Blindness discussed the deployment of troops. In view of the previous defeat in Tove City, the request this time was to not deploy troops. If they did, they would definitely win. They had to drive the Five-Star Army out of their own territory. At the same time, they had to kill those Russian peasants who had defected to the Five-Star Army as an example to others. They had to be dealt with as a warning to others that if they wanted to defect to the Five-Star Army, they had to be prepared to be killed. In this regard, the nobles in the meeting naturally agreed. In order for the army to achieve a great victory, They took the initiative to offer a sum of money as a reward to the soldiers who had contributed to this battle. Of course, they would not give in vain. The captives of this battle would become the new slaves of these nobles. With the high reward, the generals at the meeting became more active. No one would go against the money. Immediately, several generals took the initiative to step forward and asked to lead troops to suppress the five-star army. In this regard, Ivan looked on coldly from the sidelines. His eyes were filled with mockery and coldness. The existence of nobles restricted the development of the Russian Empire. These people were unscrupulous and short-sighted. Wherever there were benefits, they would be there. But when it came to offering, they would become mute and start to retreat. Moreover, these people were extremely united. Often, when they went overboard and the father wanted to deal with one of them, the others would jump out to plead for mercy. Sometimes they would even threaten the other party. The nobles who had both power and money gave the Grand Duke of Blindness a headache. When there was a huge beast like the Golden Horde outside, even though he was dissatisfied, he had to lower his head and feign civility. Sometimes, for the benefit of the nobles, he had to give up his own gains and lose the hearts of the people. This had already begun to hinder the development of the country. If the blind Grand Duke could see those drawbacks, how could the smart Ivan not see them? However, they couldn't fall out with him yet. Otherwise, the country would be riddled with internal strife before anyone else did anything. Under Ivan's cold gaze, the various nobles participated in the meeting enthusiastically. Very quickly, it was decided that Maxim would lead 10,000 White Russian musketeers, 10,000 White Russian cavalry, 30,000 White Russian infantry, and 80,000 White Russian and Mongol slaves for a total of 130,000 soldiers. Maxim was naturally able to snatch this job because he was an important leader of the city of Novgorod in the Rossi Duchy. He was also one of the generals with the greatest authority apart from the Grand Duke of Blindness. Normally, this person could be said to be a sly old fox. He wouldn't make a move if there were no benefits. Even during the war with the Golden Horde, this person wouldn't act unless there were benefits. Many times, the blind Grand Duke had to use a negotiating tone to persuade him to make a move. This time he seemed to have the five-star army in his grasp. After all, according to the battle report, the five-star army's reinforcements only had 30,000 to 40,000 cavalry. As for the previous Wuxia Third Corps, it had already been destroyed. The thing that was least needed to defend a city was cavalry. The most useless thing was also cavalry. It was just that 30,000 to 40,000 enemies weren't good at defending a city, so they were easy to deal with. Thinking that he had found an opportunity, Maxim took the initiative to ask for troops. Naturally, the nobles were very supportive. Those who had money contributed and those who had things contributed. The matter was quickly settled. Then, like stars surrounding the moon, they accompanied Maxim out of the hall. In the end, only the blind Grand Duke and his son were left. The blind Grand Duke was very optimistic about his son. Even if the Tove city army was defeated, he still thought highly of Ivan. He even thought that it wasn't a bad thing for a young man to encounter some setbacks. On the contrary, it would be helpful for his future growth. After seeing that there was no one else in the hall, Ivan spoke. He knew why his father wanted him to stay alone, so he simply said bluntly, "Father-in-law, your son doesn't think highly of Maxim's campaign this time. The Han people aren't that easy to defeat. They are likely to hit a wall." "Are our guns and cannons not enough?" the Grand Duke of Blindness asked curiously from his high seat. If we push forward layer by layer with the power of our guns and cannons, there is still a possibility of victory. But if we are too arrogant, then we will definitely fail." "That's right, Turgenev's defeat is an example." Ivan hesitated for a moment, then said with a firm tone. Ivan's meaning was very clear. If he led the army in this battle, then they would win. If it was someone else, then it would be hard to say. The blind Grand Duke laughed. How could he not understand his son's meaning? Wasn't this what he wanted? Just like how Ivan saw the arrogance of the nobles, how could the blind Grand Duke not know this? Although his eyes weren't very good, he understood in his heart. If he wanted to revitalize the Russian Empire, these nobles would undoubtedly become an extremely heavy stumbling block. If he didn't kick them to the side, then problems would occur sooner or later. However, seeing a problem in many things didn't mean that it could be solved. The nobles were very united. They would only do things that would benefit them. If there were no benefits, they would pretend to be confused and stay away. Even if someone wanted to scheme against them, there was no better way. This time, the nobles recommended Maxim to take action because they saw that the Han people had more powerful cannons and wanted to take them for themselves. Moreover, the Han people had 40,000 cavalrymen. War horses had always been something that the Russian Empire needed the most. It was because of these benefits that the nobles took action. However, they forgot about Turgenev's defeat. It must be said that the nobles couldn't be blamed. It was because Turgenev cared too much about his reputation. When he returned, he didn't mention that he had escaped. He only said that the Han army's cannons were too powerful. Seeing that he was no match for them, he couldn't possibly use human lives to make up for it. This made everyone unable to see the true strength of the Han army. Back to business. Although the blind Grand Duke knew that the Han people weren't to be trifled with, he didn't stop them. He also wanted to use this opportunity to deal a heavy blow to the nobles' strength. This would play a positive role in his better governance of the Russian Empire. Once Maxim's army was defeated, he would send his own troops to Oxino City. If he won the battle, not only would he reap the benefits, he would also be able to consolidate his authority. More importantly, he would be able to effectively intimidate the nobles. This was a good thing that could satisfy all three goals. This was what the blind Grand Duke was thinking. However, there were some things that he couldn't say out loud, even to his own son. Firstly, he couldn't leave any evidence for others to talk about. Secondly, he could use this opportunity to teach his son a lesson and let him understand the scheming of an emperor. "All right, you may leave." Knowing that he had asked all the questions he needed to ask, the Grand Duke of Blindness waved his hand with a smile. The blind Grand Duke could see everything clearly because his wisdom was unmatched. Moreover, his mind was very clear. However, the nobles couldn't do it. Just as Ivan thought, they were a group of short-sighted people. Once they saw benefits, they were like flies that saw an egg with a crack. That kind of desire couldn't be controlled. Maxim, who had been elected, was also very pleased with himself. This time, in order to support him in the war, the nobles had given him a lot of military funds. Although it was said that after the war he would have to divide the victory according to the nobles' investment. However, he was still satisfied with the nobles' actions. At least he could see the nobles' support for him. After reaching Maxim's position, it would be impossible to say that he didn't have any ambition. He also wanted to become a high and mighty existence like the blind Grand Duke. To achieve this, he had to achieve great results. Previously, when he faced the Mongol cavalry, he lacked confidence. However, now that he was facing the Han people who were known as two-legged sheep, he had no reason to be afraid. In his view, as long as his army caused trouble, the Han people would very likely flee in fear. He could even win without fighting. With great confidence and excitement, Maxim gathered his troops and set out 5 days later. His target was Oxino City. At this time in Oxino City, the Third Star Army had finished replenishing its troops. Under the temptation of extremely high pay and treatment, no less than 20,000 young and middle-aged commoners joined the army. Even so, there were many youths who weren't chosen for various reasons and left with regrets. This was the benefit of having a strong economy. Many transport teams came from the Far East region. While they brought large amounts of food, they also brought salt, sugar, iron pots, soy sauce, vinegar, cotton clothes, and other necessities for the commoners. When these things appeared in the shops of Oxino City, who knew how many commoners were blinded by them? It was to the point that every shop had to be guarded by the 5-star army. Even so, there were still many commoners pacing back and forth in front of the shops. They didn't have the Chinese currency that the 5-star army had mentioned, so they naturally couldn't buy these goods. However, even if they couldn't buy them, they could still look at them. Of course, not all commoners had the ability to buy them. For example, there were some new recruits who had just joined the 5-star army. In order to encourage them and set an example, Wuxia and Tian who discussed and gave out a portion of their allowance. Just like that, they had the first batch of customers. When the White Russian and Mongolian recruits wearing clean and tidy military uniforms took out their Chinese coins and bought some daily necessities that made people envious, the other commoners were in an uproar. They only hated that their children hadn't been accepted by the 5-star army. Otherwise, they would have been part of the people who had these good things. Chapter 1431. Just when everyone was waiting anxiously, Tian who announced a new policy. As long as the people were willing to help the 5-star army to build roads, they would be able to receive Chinese coins. Although the amount was not much, it was still a path, a hope. Wasn't it? Immediately, the citizens who had such thoughts but didn't have the ability to join the army filled up the sign-up area. With the problem of manpower solved, Tianhu and Wuxia could finally relax and focus on building up the army. At this time, another transport team entered the city. Along with it was the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Division of the Cold Front. The 4th Regiment's commander, Ling Lianquan, was ordered by Yang Qindong to come and support the defense of Oxino City. The White Russian army had many firearms. If they wanted to deal with them, they would need the help of firearms. Therefore the Cold Front came. Not only that, they also brought a large number of weapons and ammunition. They looked like they were going to fight a protracted war with the White Russian army. According to Yang Qindong's plan, they were going to attack one side at a time. Naturally, they were going to attack the Golden Horde. The intelligence department had already reported that the Golden Horde, which had been around for hundreds of years, had a very strong foundation. Especially since their ancestors had once dominated the Eastern European continent. They had plundered many good things, most of which were now in their national treasury. If they took them down first, they would be able to get their hands on many good things. It would also solve the financial pressure on the 5-star army. Xianxia was very good at making money, especially when they produced products that were ahead of their time. Their products had always been highly sought after by various factions. It was an understatement to say that they made a lot of money every day. However, in the past few years, whether it was research or military campaigns, they had spent a lot of money. If it wasn't for the fact that Laos, Vietnam and other provinces had stabilized and didn't need to invest in them anymore, they wouldn't have been able to support 3 battles at the same time with their current financial resources. Their financial resources were barely enough. During this period, Yang Qindong had even issued 3 government bonds in Xianxia's territory. Even so, when the decision was made to send troops to the Far East, there were still a few people who opposed it. One of the most important reasons was the financial pressure. They chose to start with the Golden Horde because of their wealth. If what the intelligence department said was true and the Golden Horde had a large amount of gold and silver, then the cost of the war would not be a problem. If they did well, they could even make a lot of money back. It was also a good way to take a gamble on those who opposed them. Since they had decided to go all out to deal with the Golden Horde, they could not go all out against the Rossi forces. They had to be on the defensive. Commander Ling Lianquan had received this order and had come to Oxino City. Tianhu naturally welcomed the arrival of the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment, which boosted his confidence. However, Wuxia, Chunyang and the others were even happier. They were all Leng Feng's subordinates and belonged to the first group of people to play with guns. However, because they came to Eastern Europe and were too far away from the headquarters, their guns ran out of ammunition. After a long time they started to play with cold weapons again. A while ago, when Wuxia found out that Leng Feng was going to send people over, he sent Chunyang to transport the unloaded guns that he had buried into the city. Now they only had to wait for the arrival of the Leng Feng regiment to resume the era of firearms. They had guns and ammunition, but most of the people who used them were no longer around. After searching through the entire Third Army, they only managed to find 100 or so of their old comrades. Thus, they could only form a company of Cold Vanguard and be incorporated into the Third Army's Guard Regiment. The arrival of the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment strengthened the city's defenses. At this time, the intelligence department at the front lines sent news that the White Russian army had mobilized 50,000 soldiers and 80,000 slaves and were marching towards Oxino City. They would reach the city in about 4 days. When they heard that the White Russian army was coming, Tianhu and the others were not afraid at all. Instead, they were very excited. Although the 6th young master had said that they were not allowed to take the initiative to attack, since the enemy was at their doorstep, they would not let them go. This was a good opportunity to perform. 4 days was enough for the 2 commanders and the regiment commander to make all the necessary arrangements. In the end, they decided that this time, they would take down all of the 130,000 enemies. It just so happened that the construction of the roads was a bit slow. With the addition of these new soldiers, it would be much faster. The Third Army had just recruited new soldiers and had only trained them for less than half a month. It was obviously irresponsible to send such an army to the battlefield. In the end, they were left on the city walls to be responsible for guarding the city. Normally, they would have a chance to fight a big battle while defending the city. Especially since the enemy was the main attacker this time, there should be an even more intense battle to defend the city. However, Commander Wuxia was very clear that he would not have a chance to perform well this time. According to the plan, when the enemy appeared, the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment would use their firepower to suppress them. While the enemy was in chaos, the 4th Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Regiment would charge out from all directions and destroy the enemy. It was easy to say. After all, the enemy had an army of over 100,000. Logically speaking, it would not be easy to defeat them. However, since it was the 2nd Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment, Wuxia did not have any doubts. He also understood that the so-called defending the city was just watching from the sidelines. Wuxia did not want to watch the others fight and eat the meat and soup while he could only watch from the sidelines. After the meeting, he returned to the army and immediately issued an order. Once the battle went smoothly, the entire 3rd Army would be sent out. Although they were not very strong and could not inflict heavy damage to the enemy, they should be able to capture captives, right? For this reason, he even came up with a set of rewards. For example, what would be the reward for capturing 1 captive and what would be the reward for capturing 2 captives? The order was quickly passed down through the military headquarters to the various divisions, regiments, battalions, companies, platoons, and finally every squad. When the new soldiers heard that the enemy was the 130,000 soldiers of the White Russians, they were so scared that they did not know what to do. Some of the more timid ones even trembled all over. They looked as if they could be beaten to the ground with a slap at any time. However, when the rewards were announced, the new soldiers who came back to their senses became excited again. Without exception, they were all children of poor families. At least 80% of them were used to being looked down upon and treated coldly when they were growing up. In their minds, their lives were cheap and they didn't know when they could die. But now it was the 5-star army of the Han people who gave them respect and dignity. They could eat their fill, wear new clothes, and earn money. Now that there was an opportunity to perform meritorious deeds in front of them, why would they not give it a try? At most they would die. However, if they could survive and perform meritorious deeds, wouldn't that improve the living conditions of their families? If they did well, it was not impossible for them to become a role model for their families. There were not many people who were shameless. The new soldiers who had just enjoyed the taste of being respected liked this feeling even more. Now that there was an even better opportunity to perform meritorious deeds in front of them, although they were still a little afraid, the rewards of victory had stimulated them to forget all their fears. They secretly decided that if there was an opportunity to perform meritorious deeds, they would do it even if it meant risking their lives. Time passed day by day. Outside Oxino City, the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front had already dug trenches. The crisscrossing trenches were the most effective way to deal with cavalry and artillery. They had already learned that the White Russians had guns and cannons. It seemed that their strength was not bad. However, in reality, the enemy's cannons were mostly solid bullets. These cannons could fire up to 3 to 4 li away. Although it looked terrifying, if the trenches were set up, the metal balls would be turned into scrap metal before they could even reach them. The White Russians also had exploding bullets, but their attack range was limited. It was only about 1 li. At such a close range, they would have some advantage against cold weapons. However, against the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front, they were too weak. They were so weak that they would not even give the enemy a chance to fire. After the trenches were dug, the world's #1 cavalry army followed their plan and left the city in batches in the middle of the night. They jumped out of the battlefield and formed an even larger encirclement. When the enemy appeared, they would counter-encircle them and press the White Russians to the ground. Everything was ready. On the afternoon of the 4th day after receiving the news, a black mass of people appeared in the distance of Oxino City. The White Russians had finally arrived. They arrived in the afternoon. After waiting for the rear troops to arrive, the entire army camp stretched for more than 10 li. It looked majestic and gave people a feeling that they were invincible. Riding on this momentum, General Maxim led a group of people to the front of the formation. They saw the trenches that the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front had dug. These things are complicated and won't be easy to deal with. The White Russian general in charge of the 10,000 musketeers said with a serious expression. It doesn't matter if it's easy or not. We have 80,000 slaves with us. Even if we have to use their lives, we will fill up these trenches. How about this? Let's fire a few cannons to show our military might. Maxim said with an unconcerned expression. From his point of view, he already had a huge advantage in terms of military strength. In addition, the nobles were very supportive this time, providing him with 100 cannons. Among them there were 10 exploding cannons. The amount of ammunition they had prepared was also very ample. There was no city that they could not take down. Under Maxim's order, dozens of cannons were fired at the same time before the sky turned dark, smashing towards Oxino City. However, because of the trenches, they all fell into the trenches after rolling for a while. To this he did not care. In fact, he even arrogantly believed that the appearance of these trenches would restrict the charge of the Han cavalry. This way he would have the complete initiative and could do whatever he wanted. Chapter 1432. After a series of explosions, the White Russian army started to set up their tents and cook. When Ling Lianquan saw this scene, he was furious. The other side's disregard made him feel insulted, and he suddenly had a bold idea. Since the other party was looking down on them, why couldn't they turn around and launch a surprise attack on them? Night raids were one of the subjects that the cold front soldiers often trained in. Their meals were always good and they didn't have any problems with night blindness. Adding on a surprise attack, they could catch the other side off guard. After coming up with this bold idea, Ling Lianquan first returned to the city to report to the commander of the 3rd Corps, Wuxia. Wuxia, who also felt that it was feasible, agreed and then immediately communicated with the commander of the 1st Corps, Tianhu, who was lying in ambush outside. Tianhu, who didn't adhere to tactics, naturally didn't object. He couldn't wait any longer and didn't want to spend another night. It would be best if they could attack a minute earlier. After the three reached a consensus, a new battle plan was formed. There weren't many changes from before, but the time of attack was brought forward. The weather in Eastern Europe in August was quite good. Even at night, not only was it not hot, but it was also quite cool. The White Russian army, who had been rushing for a few days, quickly fell asleep. Many of them had excited expressions on their faces, as if they were already dreaming of breaking through the gates of Oxino City and massacring the Hans. In the trench 300 meters in front of the White Russian camp, Commander Ling Lianquan had already led 2,000 cold front soldiers to take a detour, and they were ready to attack at any time. Raising his wrist to look at the military watch, Ling Lianquan solemnly said to the radio operator beside him, "Prepare the signal gun." About 10 seconds later, a red signal flare rose into the air. In the dark and silent night, it was very eye-catching and dazzling. The rise of the signal flare also signified the start of the counterattack. At this moment, the cannons roared and the 8 100mm mortars of the 4th Regiment began to let out their unique roar. Of the 8 cannons, 4 of them were aimed at the White Russian Army's cannon formation, while the other 4 were casually fired at the White Russian camp. Every time a cannonball landed, it would cause the earth to tremble and there would be cries and screams. The cannonballs were completely random. Some hit 2 to 3 miles away, while others landed 7 to 8 miles away. This created a feeling of gunfire everywhere. There were enemies everywhere. It was a general trend of insecurity. The first to be completely destroyed was the artillery formation of the White Russian Army. The 100 cannons were originally placed together for the sake of concentrating them to gain the upper hand. Now the cold front 4th Regiment was able to destroy all the cannons effortlessly. Some of them landed on the cannonballs of the exploding cannonballs and immediately caused them to explode, causing the flames to soar into the sky and increasing the power of the cannonballs. The White Russian Army was completely unprepared and did not expect the Han Chinese to have cannons as well, so they were caught off guard. When Maxim walked out of the tent, he saw countless people running around like headless flies in the chaotic camp. Under the random bombardment, no one knew where was the safest. They could only run around helplessly and bet on their luck. Don't panic, don't panic. Everyone gathered together. The enemy's forces are inferior to ours, so they won't dare to charge. In order to stabilize the morale of the soldiers, Maxim roared loudly. Even the soldiers beside him did the same. With so many people shouting in unison, the effect was not bad. At the very least, the camp was no longer as chaotic. Many of the generals also began to look for their subordinates, preparing to launch a counterattack after taking a roll call. However, this action came to an end with the rumbling of hooves. 8 cannons might be able to deal limited damage to an army of more than a dozen miles and an army of more than 100,000 men, but the damage they could inflict on the cavalry coming from all directions was unimaginable. They did not know how many enemies there were, nor did they know where they would appear. Instinctively, the 1,000-man commanders and major commanders began to run around. They no longer had the heart to fight. Right now they were only thinking about how to escape from the chaos. The number 1 cavalry army had finally made their move. This was the first time they had attacked together ever since they became a first-class unit. As the commander Tian, who was very excited. The 5 division commanders below him were also very excited. Everyone had the desire to compete with each other. Using platoons as a unit, they formed hundreds of arrow formations that came from all directions. The high-speed warhorses and sharp divine weapons allowed them to charge into the White Russian army like killing gods in the night. With a raise of their weapons, countless White Russians were beheaded. Countless cowardly rats threw down their weapons and lay on the ground, trembling. They were all begging for their lives. This was an unequal battle. There was no such thing as fairness. On one side there was an unbridled slaughter. They displayed their bloodthirsty methods and opened their bloody mouths. On the other side there were people fleeing in all directions. The generals did not know their soldiers and the soldiers did not know their generals. In the chaos there were countless people who ran away. Maxim was also fleeing crazily on his horse under the protection of dozens of bodyguards. His face was filled with fear, especially when a cannonball landed 7 or 8 meters away from him. The powerful shockwave sent one of his soldiers flying. That feeling of fear became even more intense. Right now he was no longer thinking about fighting with the 5-star army. He only wanted to flee far away. It would be best if they never met again. If the commander was like this, one could only imagine how the soldiers were feeling. They were all busy fleeing. If they could not escape, they would just surrender. The 80,000 slaves following the army were doing much better. They were originally unable to control their own fate. Now that their master's army had been defeated, they were just slaves of the White Russians. Did not matter. They just had to surrender. Just like that, the 80,000 slaves chose to surrender without any burden. This allowed the number 1 cavalry army, which originally did not have the advantage in numbers, to finally have the advantage in numbers. They began to chase after the fleeing White Russian army. Within Oxino City, the southern gate was already open. The 30,000 soldiers of the Third Army rushed out and charged toward the battlefield. When the cannons had been fired, they had been watching from the city walls. When they saw the previously insufferably arrogant White Russian army lose the ability to resist in such a short period of time, their eyes were filled with excitement. This meant that they would not encounter any danger in the process of snatching captives. It would be much smoother. At this moment, many of the nervous and fearful recruits raised their heads high. They were as proud as a general who had just won a battle. Finally, the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front charged out of the trenches. Relying on the 95 style in their hands, they continuously charged and fired. Whenever they discovered a White Russian soldier holding a weapon, regardless of their status, whether they were a general or a soldier, they would fire a bullet at them. Their bravery caused the White Russian army, who were already in a sorry state, to feel as if they had lost their parents. Their desire to resist was quickly suppressed. The 4th Regiment of the Cold Front also launched an attack. Behind them, the 3rd Army also charged out, making full use of their advantage in numbers. This battle lasted from midnight all the way to noon the next day. When more and more civilians climbed up the city walls and saw the scene in front of them, who knew how many of them shed tears of joy? The 5-star army had arrived. They could finally eat their fill and wear warm clothes. There was finally hope for their lives. However, most people were not happy because they did not know how long this kind of life could last. Their many years of experience told them that the White Russian army would not sit back and watch this happen. As expected, not long after, they heard that the White Russian army had sent 130,000 soldiers to Oxino City. At this moment, many people revealed expressions of fear. The civilians who had originally wanted to save up Chinese coins to buy better goods also hurriedly spent their money. They were afraid that the 5-star army would be defeated by the White Russian army. If that happened, the Chinese coins in their hands would be worthless. Rather than that, it was better to buy things that they had already bought. At the very least, it was something that truly existed. Just yesterday, when they heard that the White Russian army had arrived, many civilians had already packed up their things. They had made the decision that if the 5-star army was defeated, they would seize the city and leave. Although the five-star army had treated them well and was much better than the White Russian army in this chaotic world, there was no such thing as morality. Barely surviving was the most important thing. But no one could have imagined that in just one night, the seemingly powerful White Russian army would be defeated. Moreover, it was a crushing defeat. They didn't even have the ability to counterattack. Not even a single hole could be found on the walls of Oxino City. On the city walls, the civilians cheered. The five-star army's victory meant that their beautiful lives would continue. There was hope for their future. Some of the civilians also began to regret spending the Chinese coins that they had saved up with great difficulty. Some of them could have bought a good iron pot if they had worked hard. Now their hopes had been ruined by their own hands. The good thing was that as long as the five-star army was still the ruler of this place, it would not be long before they could achieve what they wanted. The five-star army had won a great victory. The world's #1 cavalry regiment had chased for 40 li before returning. This battle had dealt a heavy blow to the White Russian army. Just in terms of prisoners, they had captured 110,000 people. There were also 10,000 White Russian army corpses on the battlefield. In other words, only 5,000 White Russian soldiers had managed to escape. They had also seized a lot of military rations and equipment. This was not a small gain for Oxino City. Chapter 1433. Report our victory to the sixth young master, haha. Tian, whose usual calm demeanor was replaced with excitement. Not only did a night and half a day of fighting not tire him out, he was also very excited. Because in yesterday's battle he saw the might of the world's #1 cavalry army. In the past, when they were only a division, they could defeat enemies several times their size. And looking at their performance last night, no one could stop the 40,000 cavalry. Even if they were to face 100,000 enemies, they would not back down. They were very confident that they could obtain victory. Soon Yang Qindong found out about the battle in Oxino City through the telegram. After reading the telegram, he did not think much of it and only chuckled. Very good, after this battle there will be no more battles here this year. Send a telegram to Tianhu and Wu Xing to properly manage the place. Take advantage of the time before it snows to properly repair the roads. After it snows, properly manage the greenhouse. Do not neglect it. Yang Qindong was a person who liked to take one step and look 3 steps ahead. Considering the cold of winter in Eastern Europe, Yang Qindong had ordered a large number of greenhouse workers to be transported from Red Nest City. The land here was fertile, so it would not be difficult to solve the problem of food. He wanted to let the foreign people who followed him, regardless of the reason, know that as long as they followed him, they would not go hungry. As for eating better and wearing better clothes, they would need to work harder. Not only in Oxino City, Yang Qindong had already arranged for people to set up a large number of greenhouses in Polga, Kazan, and the other 3 cities. He was only waiting for the arrival of winter. When they could no longer work outside, they would work indoors. This year, because they were not prepared enough, they would be like this for now. In the future, when they developed, he would also transport steam engines here. At that time, many light industrial products could be chosen to be manufactured here, so that there would be work to do in winter, and this place would not become a paradise for lazy people. The so-called paradise for lazy people referred to the fact that because of the weather, they could only work for half a year and rest for half a year. This was more suitable for those who were naturally lazy. Without something as advanced as the telegram, the news of the defeat of the White Russians was not sent back by fast horse until 3 days later. On this day, the blind Great Justice was having a meeting with the officials in the hall, discussing the matters of preparing for winter. It was also at this moment that the battle report from the front lines came back. The travel-worn signaler knelt on the ground, not even daring to raise his head. From the attitude of the signaler, it was often possible to tell whether the news was good or bad. The officials and nobles who had experience in this aspect looked at each other, speechless. The blind duke, who had already predicted the battle ahead, didn't panic. Instead, he said calmly, "What is the battle ahead? Tell me quickly." Grand Duke. After the signaler acknowledged the order, he took out a battle report from a tool that looked like a basket and read it out loud. It was a tradition of the Rossi duchies to read battle reports in public. Perhaps they were afraid that someone would hide battle reports that were unfavorable to them, so they would usually read them out in public when they received battle reports to show fairness. Because of this, Ivan, who was standing at the side, could see the rapid changes in the expressions of the officials and nobles. The battle report didn't have many words, but the amount of information in it wasn't small. Maxim had returned in defeat. Of the 130,000 soldiers, less than 5,000 remained, and they were currently on their way back to Moscow. Not only that, the battle had only taken half a day, and the White Russian army's rations and supplies had all been plundered by the Han army. In just a short while, the officials and nobles of the White Russian army had ugly expressions. They hadn't expected the army to be defeated, and even more so for it to be defeated so quickly. What is this Maxim doing? Is he such a good-for-nothing? We gave him so many cannons and good things, but what did he do? What a disappointment. Maxim was incompetent in training his army, resulting in the defeat of his army. He should be hanged for this crime. That's right, the Rossi duchies don't need incompetent generals. Kill him. Kill him, kill him. Within a short period of time, a large number of voices appeared in the imperial court to condemn Maxim, with the nobles being the heaviest among them. At this moment, they seemed to have forgotten how they had praised Maxim for leading the army. This was the nobles. In their eyes, there were only benefits. It was best not to talk about favors with such people. Otherwise, you would be very sad. The voices were so loud that it felt as if Maxim had committed some heinous crime. Ivan looked at this scene coldly and he was extremely shocked. He hadn't expected the firearms of the Han to be so powerful, and it seemed to be even more powerful than theirs. If that was the case, not only would they have powerful cavalry, but they would also have firearms. The Han people would truly be a difficult opponent to deal with. Even though Ivan had tried his best to overestimate the strength of the five-star army, he had still underestimated his opponent. The firearms of the five-star army were not just a little bit more powerful than the White Russian army, but much more powerful. Ivan really wanted to experience the power of the five-star army, but it was already the 9th month. If he were to prepare for war now, there wouldn't be enough time. It seemed that he could only leave all his regrets for next year. On the other hand, when the blind Archduke heard that everyone in the court wanted to punish Maxim, he immediately took the opportunity to deprive this person of nearly half of his military power and allowed him to reflect on his crimes at home. He would talk about it when he figured it out. After this battle, he hadn't suffered any losses, but the nobles had suffered heavy injuries. He had also lost a powerful general like Maxim, so the blind duke was naturally in a good mood. He even had to thank the Han army for appearing. At the end of the meeting, the blind duke also said that it was too late this year. After the flowers bloomed tomorrow, he would send troops to attack Oxino City to show the might of the White Russian army. After receiving the promise, the ministers and nobles left the hall with satisfied looks on their faces. To them, the appearance of the Han army was a threat that could even attract ordinary people to follow suit. If they didn't suppress this trend, it would greatly affect their interests. This was not allowed. As long as the Han army was defeated and chased away, it didn't matter who did it in the end. This was the face of the bigwigs. In their eyes, they only cared about their own interests and their own petty schemes. How could the blind duke not see this? However, he didn't have a better idea. Although he was powerful, his words didn't carry weight in the White Russian army. Without the support of these nobles, the Rossi duchies would have internal strife. If that happened, not to mention dealing with others, it would be a problem for them to protect themselves. For the sake of the Rossi's interests, for the sake of righteousness, he sometimes had to compromise. Although he knew that these nobles were malignant tumors, he had no choice but to keep them. He only hoped that after the Rossi Empire completely controlled this land, they would slowly be eliminated. In fact, this wasn't just a problem of the Rossi Empire. The Great Ming Empire also had this characteristic. The nobles and wealthy families were like troublemakers that hindered the development of the Great Ming Empire. Although the emperor knew about this, he was powerless to solve it. On this point, Xianxia was the best. In history, any king who founded a country did very well. This was because they started from nothing and it was easy for them to centralize power. This allowed their decrees to be quickly passed down. However, in order to stabilize the situation, they had to balance it out. More and more people with real power would appear, and in the end the power would be dispersed. Even a powerful country wouldn't be able to achieve the cooperation of all its citizens. Yang Qindong was like a king who founded a country. His prestige and authority were unparalleled. Whenever he made a decision, even if someone opposed it, it would be difficult to stop him. In addition, Yang Qindong brought new knowledge, and with the help of Datsong this great achievement was achieved. Yang Qindong had long been aware of this. He constantly increased the intensity and speed of this construction. Just as winter was about to arrive, and whether it was the Golden Horde or the Rossi Principalities, he was still busy commanding the 5-star army. More and more roads were being built and more greenhouses were being built. Under the lead of Chief Engineer Feng Ku, the most advanced research lab in Xianxia City had already upgraded the steam engine 3 times. Now the steam train was being developed and most of it had already taken shape. Only a few key steps were needed and the so-called first steam train could be tested. With the books and knowledge provided by Yang Qindong, once the first steam engine, which was the most difficult part, was built, the rest would be very simple and smooth. When the news of this spread, Xianxia City was the first to lay the tracks. A 40-kilometer-long railway was built from the factory to the port. Once it was opened to traffic, all the products produced would be sent to the port faster and distributed to the various regions. The laying of the tracks in Laos, Vietnam and other Southeast Asian provinces was also in the final stages. They had already made the preparations and laid the foundation. Now they only needed to lay the tracks according to the predetermined route. Once the tracks were opened to traffic, several provinces would be quickly connected. This way goods and people could be quickly sent to each other. Once that time came, no matter where the problem was, the army could take the train to arrive in the shortest time possible. This would play a more positive role in stabilizing the security of the territory. The tracks from the 3 eastern provinces to the Far East were also being laid. This would be the first railway road in the region. Its role in supplying supplies to Eastern Europe could not be measured by money. Chapter 1434. On the other hand, the railway from the Far East to Eastern Europe wasn't easy to build. It had to pass through the Siberian and Ural regions to reach the Volga region. There were many forests and rivers along the way, which greatly hindered the construction of the railway. For this reason, after Yang Qindong understood the actual situation, he adopted the method of building a bridge when it met a river and digging a hole when it met a mountain. If it was a large mountain, he would take a detour. If it was a small mountain, he would use explosives to flatten it, or dig a hole through which the train could pass through. In these years, Xiaxia's mining work had developed rapidly, and he had the experience and strength to create a cave. Even so, it would take at least a few years to build this railway. Fortunately, Yang Qindong could afford to wait, and what he didn't lack the most now was manpower. Just a moment ago, after the great victory in Oxino City, Tian Hu and Wu Xing had sent another 100,000 people, and they were all young and strong men. With these people, the construction and development of the railway would be greatly promoted. What he needed to do now was to take advantage of the time before it snowed to build a wider and longer road. Once it snowed, some of the work would have to stop. And the transportation of goods couldn't be stopped. For this reason, Yang Qindong had already arranged for a sleigh. It could easily slide through the snow even if it was full of goods. This way he could take advantage of the heavy snow to transport more goods into the city. In this way he would be able to do what he needed to do at the beginning of spring tomorrow. Because of the upcoming snow, Eastern Europe became quiet. Whether they liked it or not, a tripartite situation had already formed. This was one of Yang Qindong's biggest gains after coming here. Compared to Yang Qindong's gains, the Yarqiang and Tulyafan tribes in the Ili Belly region were officially under Xiaxia's control. The 5-star army that was left there had even started a war against Ili Belly. By the time Yang Qindong left, the situation of the war had already become clear. But to everyone's surprise, King Bao Lide of Ili had been so determined that in order to strike at the 5-star army, he had betrayed the interests of his own country. He had separately asked for help from the nearby Timur Empire, Kazakh and Yusang, and had also stated that they would provide the provisions for the army. After defeating the 5-star army, the territory would be divided among the 4. When Prime Minister Ali Pu was in charge of Ili, he had accumulated a large amount of military supplies for the entire country. Now they were all being used. The appearance of the 4-way army placed considerable pressure on the 5-star army. The good thing was that the enemy was already at the end of their rope. Compared to the Yang faction who had a stable rear and a strong economy, they weren't afraid of anyone in a protracted battle. Once the enemy's rations ran out, it would be the time for the 5-star army to win the battle. It just so happened that they could take the opportunity to have a good fight with the four-nation coalition. It was not a bad thing to wipe out their vital forces. The war on the land had to stop because of the weather. But the expedition on the sea showed no signs of stopping. After occupying Sri Lanka, the navy had taken Kaji, Guri, Halunos and other cities. They had now reached the Persian Gulf, and according to their previous plan, they were building a naval supply base here. This place would become a new and important supply base for the navy when it went on expeditions all over the world. Equipped with powerful firearms and cannons, they had the world's most elite cold vanguard navy. Wherever the navy with the 5-star flag went, they were like dragons entering the sea, unstoppable. In the short span of half a year, the wealth they plundered was equivalent to 120 million taels of silver. The number of slaves they plundered from various countries also reached over 6 million. Currently, they had already been sent back to the headquarters in Crimson City through the supply ships. After so many years, the investment in the navy had never been enough. Now it was finally time to reap the rewards. When a large amount of gold and silver was sent back to the treasury of Xianxia, Zhou Xian and the rest were all smiles. Now there were no ministers who would stop the navy from going out to sea. Compared to the wealth in his hands, the change in mindset of the officials made Yang Chendong feel more gratified. Although his authority was not something that could be shaken by the officials, but having people clamoring in his ears every day was not a good thing. This was also one of the reasons why Yang Chendong would rather suffer with the army and risk the dangers of going on expeditions than stay in Kiosk City. He really could not stand the whispers and complaints of the officials every day. However, these people were doing it for his own good. He could not do anything to them, so he could only endure it. And the harvest of the navy could finally make some people shut their mouths. He could finally have some peace and quiet. All in all, the year 1462 was a year of harvest. It was also the year that Xianxia expanded outwards. In the past, the main focus of the 5-star army was on the grasslands. There were not many gains from fighting there. The other side was so poor that they did not have much wealth. Defeating them would only give them some land and some captives. Compared to the huge expenditure of the army, it felt like they were at a disadvantage. Just like the war with Ely right now, they had invested a lot and gained very little. Because of this, who knew how many officials had already raised their opinions? Even Zhou Xian and the rest had vaguely expressed their dissatisfaction. Only then did Yang Chendong decide to expand his army and look for more sources of income. Although expanding his army would suddenly increase the pressure on his finances. But if there were gains, then the benefits would be even greater. Fortunately, it seemed like he had made the right choice. At least the expedition on the sea had a good result. In the next year, after Yang Chendong defeated the Golden Horde, his gains would also be great. At that time, the voices of obstructions would be suppressed to a minimum. Because of the weather, the army had to stop their advance. But in Kiosk City, where it was spring all year round, the impact of winter was limited. The factories continued to operate without interruption. All kinds of products were produced and sent to various places. The 70mm field cannons had already overcome all the difficulties and began to be produced in batches. The problem with the explosive shells was also solved. They could now fire up to 8 li away. This allowed them to successfully replace the 100mm mortars used by the 5-star army, becoming the main artillery of the army. Speaking of which, although the field cannons were easy to move and could be carried by 4 soldiers, compared to the 100mm mortars, they were still slightly heavier. But the army still gave up on the mortars and changed to field cannons. The reason was because the mortars were all from the warehouse. Even the process of making the shells was very troublesome. With Xianxia's technology, it was impossible to make such a good thing. They had been imitating it all along. It was like a primary school student suddenly learning middle school and high school knowledge. It was very difficult to learn, but it was not a problem for him to copy the answers. But this was not the way to go in the long run. After dismantling the cannons in the warehouse countless times and copying them, the field cannons were finally produced. Because they were self-made by Xianxia, all the parts were complete. With all the parts, the number of cannons continued to increase. Finally, it was time to equip the entire army. Although there was still a long way to go before it could be used at will, the production cost of the explosive shells wasn't low, and the production time was not short. However, with the continuous improvement of the steam engine technology, the replacement would be faster and faster. One day all the complicated problems would be simplified. By then, the production cost of the explosive shells would be infinitely reduced, and the five-star army would really be invincible in the world. A large number of field cannons were produced and shipped to various battlefields. In the warehouse of Kazan City, there was a row of 20 cannons that had just been shipped over. The distance of a few thousand li took these cannons a few months to arrive in front of Yang Chendong. He gently touched these cold field cannons and was very emotional. These were independent cannons made by the Xianxia munitions factory. Their appearance was enough to prove that their efforts over the years were not in vain. Their technology was finally effective and he no longer needed to rely on the warehouse. There were still many advanced weapons in the warehouse, but Yang Chendong rarely used them. If a country wanted to develop, it was impossible to rely on one person. Not to mention that his goal was the entire world. If he relied on himself he could survive, but what about the future? After all, he couldn't allow the Hans to fall again just because he left, right? Right now, saving himself was what he had been doing. For the research department led by Feng Ku, Yang Chendong had always given them the best treatment and the best policies. Whatever they wanted to know, whatever they needed to know, he taught them without holding back. The only thing left was to open their heads and directly put things inside. Because of this, who knows how many people were jealous and raised doubts, but they were all suppressed by his words that carried enormous weight. Finally, his efforts paid off and Yang Chendong could finally let out a sigh of relief. In the past he only relied on his personal authority to promote policies and methods, but now that more and more people understood what he was doing, there was no need to explain anything to them. Young master, these field cannons are too ugly. Beta Persei, who did not know what Yang Chendong was thinking, also touched the field cannon and even lifted it up to feel its bulkiness. He then shook his head and said with some dissatisfaction, "What do you know?" Yang Chendong snorted coldly. He was very disdainful of Beta Persei's short-sightedness. This was a self-produced product that belonged to the modern era. Mortars were things in the warehouse and belonged to artillery hundreds of years later. How could they be compared? Chapter 1435. Why don't I understand? Beta Persei seemed to be a little anxious. He was afraid that Yang Chendong would look down on him, so he added, "Young master, this field artillery is not as good as mortars in terms of size, range, and power. But its shells are cheap. With this kind of artillery you can fire shells at will. How can this be compared to mortars?" Yang Chendong snorted. With just one sentence, Beta Persei was instantly speechless. The lack of artillery shells had always been one of the main factors restricting the development and growth of the five-star army. Usually, unless it was necessary, the five-star army would not use mortars in battle. Even if they did use mortars, there would be a limit to the number of shells they could fire. They would have to calculate the number of shells they could fire, which gave people a very uncomfortable feeling. For this reason, some people in the army also raised questions. Why couldn't they prepare more shells for war? In response to this question, Yang Chendong directly suppressed it by saying that the cost of shells was too high. Fortunately, researchers would not have any connection with the army. This was also one of Yang Chendong's strategies to govern the place. The army was only responsible for war, the civil servants were only responsible for governing the place, and the scientific researchers were only responsible for development and research. The parties could not have any horizontal connection, which made the other departments very mysterious in the eyes of the people in the department. So this answer blocked a lot of people's mouths. Now, with the appearance of the field artillery, Yang Chendong did not have to find so many excuses to explain the origin of the artillery in the future. And when he said that they could use shells at will, Beta Persei immediately became very excited. "Young master, can we really fire at will?" Not at will, but the number of shells is always higher than mortars. Oh, by the way, the officials in South City just reported that the greenhouse there is ready for harvest. You can take some people to take a look. Yang Chendong was afraid that Yang Heir would raise the idea of casually firing cannonballs, so he would try firing 2 cannonballs first. Yang Chendong sent him away with one sentence. After Beta Persei left, Yang Chendong also had some peace. Then he looked at Qiu Vi, the captain of the Black Cavalry, and said, "Send a message to Cheng City and let them transport more shells. After spring, we will let the enemy know that in the face of our 5-star army, they don't even have the qualifications to fight back." The weather was getting colder and colder and Eastern Europe was covered in snow. In the past, this time was the most difficult time for the people. Many people would even freeze or starve to death because of the cold weather and lack of food. But with the arrival of the 5-star army, everything changed. A large amount of food transported through the 3 eastern provinces made the people no longer starving. Although it was not enough to completely fill their stomachs with 3 meals a day, it was not a problem to have 2 meals a day. In particular, the harvest of the greenhouse allowed more green vegetables to appear in the city. This was something that no one dared to dream about. Now it had actually been realized. Many people knelt on the ground and sighed at the superb magic of King Wunan of Daimyong. At the same time, they were even more determined to follow him. Many people were already prepared to work hard after spring to earn more Chinese coins. In this way, they could buy more food in the coming winter and say goodbye to the days of hunger and cold. A large number of potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, and other seeds were sent to the warehouse. With these high-yielding seeds, Yang Qindong believed that next year would be a bumper harvest. From then on, the people here would not only say goodbye to the life of not having enough to eat, but also become a new food base in the future. It would become a bridgehead from here to the European mainland, and become another existence like the first city. This winter quietly passed by under the expectations of the people. In the 3rd month of the year 1493, the weather began to warm up. After the snow began to melt, the 4 cities with the smell of Xianxia shone with a new youth. Countless people walked out of their homes and went out of the city to build roads. For them, having something to do and earning Chinese coins was the best life. In the 3rd month, the snow on the roads began to melt. The soldiers were also in high spirits and prepared to go to war. Among them, the tens of thousands of new soldiers were the most excited. This winter, they were able to bask in the glory of being part of the 5-star army. They were able to wear thick and warm military coats. Some of the officers who had performed well were even given black down jackets. When they wore these clothes, they were no longer afraid in the cold weather. For a period of time, the matter of a down jacket being exchanged for a wife was happening among the people. Unexpectedly, there was a great tendency that the supply could not meet the demand. This was something that Yang Qindong did not expect. However, in this era of poverty where human life was the most worthless, it really happened. Yang Qindong did not know whether to laugh or cry when he heard this. However, this also showed that Xia's items were very popular. The story of a down jacket being exchanged for a wife spread in the army. This made many new soldiers who could not find a wife excited. They also longed for an opportunity to get a down jacket. Under the stimulation of material goods, the morale of the army was very high. Yang Qindong knew that it was time to take the initiative. With 30,000 veterans of the new Second Army as the main force, 60,000 new soldiers of the White Russian Division as the support, and the 3 main regiments of the 2nd Division of the 2nd Cold Front Army, an artillery battalion and an Air Force division, a total of 120,000 people left Kazan City in the middle of March and went straight to the nearest city, Samara. Yes, the Air Force also came. Major General Tianyu, the commander of the Air Force, came to Eastern Europe with Sun Lixing, the commander of the 1st Division, to report to Yang Qindong. The 5-star army had 3 main forces: sea, land, and air. However, in reality, the Air Force was often ignored. They had the least number of people, and the hot air balloons under their control also needed the cooperation of the weather. This made them unable to display their original strength on the battlefield, so they could not be counted on in many wars. Seeing the army eating meat and expanding the territory, the navy also began to move and began to rampage on the sea, attacking cities and seizing land. The supreme commander of the Air Force, Major General Tianyu, finally could not hold back. He begged Feng Ku, the first engineer of the Science and Technology Research Institute, and even borrowed a science and technology development team from him at the risk of being impeached. Under the efforts of this team, not only was the direction problem of the hot air balloon solved, but they also created a hydrogen balloon that flew higher than the original one. On the modified hot air balloon, a steam engine was added. After changing the power source, it ensured that they could fly however they wanted in the air and fly wherever they wanted. They did not need to rely on the wind to move forward. They could stay in the air for a full 24 hours, which was enough to deal with the general needs of the war. After the improvement, the commander of the Tianyu army continuously reported to Yang Qindong, requesting to go out and fight. In the end, he got such an opportunity to perform. At that moment, he traveled tens of thousands of li, first arriving at the 3 eastern provinces on a ship from Crimson City, then to the Far East region and then to Siberia. Even during the new year he spent it on the road. Finally, a week ago he arrived at Kazan City, just in time for the attack plan. In order to verify that Tianyu's words were not exaggerated, Yang Qindong first watched his performance in the air. After seeing that he indeed had the ability to shoot wherever he wanted, he waved his hand and agreed to let him participate in the military plan to attack the Golden Horde. With the cooperation of the Air Force and the 275mm field cannons that were delivered in several batches, Yang Qindong led his army of 120,000 confidently out of Kazan City and headed straight for Samara City. These 120,000 people were just the first echelon. Behind him, there was a newly built second division of the White Russia with 60,000 members. After the 5-star army's main force attacked the city, they would be responsible for logistics, battlefield cleaning and prisoner guarding. The commander of the second division was Nikolaev. From the first generation's temporary commander to the commander of the second division, Nikolaev was noble and took the initiative to let Huri be the commander of the first division. In his words, Huri was once a great Khan, and knew how to manage an army better than he did. Nikolaev's modesty in Yang Qindong's eyes made him very satisfied. From his observation these days, this person's learning ability was very strong and most importantly he was very loyal. He never thought of himself as a White Russian, on the contrary he applied to become a Han citizen several times. He even said in front of everyone that a person's origin could not be changed, and all he could do was to become a qualified Han citizen through his own efforts. Such a loyal person and also a talent, Yang Qindong of course had no reason to let him go. With a wave of the pen he agreed to his request to become a Han citizen, and gave him the position of commander of the second division. He also left a battalion of the new Second Army to be responsible for his safety. In the end it was also to monitor him. Yang Qindong would never easily trust a person of another race. Even if he trusted that the other party would not do anything to betray him, he still had to take the necessary measures. After temporarily handing over the matters of the rear to Nikolaev, Yang Qindong led the 120,000 troops out of the city and headed south. As soon as he moved, the scouts of the Golden Horde who had been watching his movements immediately reacted and reported the matter to the Great Khan. In the Golden Horde, Muhammad summoned the generals to discuss how to deal with the 5-star army. Since they did not know the strength of the 5-star army, all the generals had a relaxed look on their faces. Especially the ferocious Muhammad, who had a look of disdain as he said, "These Hans are really looking for death. We did not go look for them but they came to seek their own deaths. Great Khan, I will ask 50,000 elite cavalry to hunt outside Samara and capture these 2-footed sheep as slaves." Chapter 1436. Hearing Muhammad's words, all the generals present burst into laughter. To them the Han people were still as weak as they had been in the past. They only knew how to open their mouths and act like scholars. For such people, not to mention 120,000, even if it was 1-2 million, what was there to be afraid of? All right, this Khan approves. Muhammad also had a smile on his face. He believed that as long as Muhammad made a move he would teach the Han people how to behave. In this world he would always be the boss and could only be him. Originally he was still thinking about how to deal with these Han people. If the other party only hid in the city and did not come out it would be a headache. The 130,000 people that Gray led suddenly disappeared last year was proof of this. Now that the other party had come out of the city, it was equivalent to a tortoise crawling out of its shell. What was there to be afraid of? The cavalry on the grasslands would hunt, and this was what the Mongolian cavalry was best at. Muhammad, who had originally treated the 5-star army as his greatest enemy, suddenly realized that he had overestimated the other party. At this moment his number one enemy was the blind Duke of Ross. He even thought that after defeating the Han people he should let them be the vanguard to counterattack the White Russians. Perhaps it would be time for him to reunite this place. The generals of the Golden Horde all looked down on the Han army, but to Zhou Xian, who was guarding Samara, he did not have the slightest intention of looking down on them. Especially when he saw the 120,000 Han soldiers coming from outside the city, there was only caution on his face. It was said that one could see the whole leopard from a single spot, and see the overall situation from a corner. As someone who had led troops for many years, Zhou Xian could feel that the Han army was not to be trifled with from the other party's formation. From afar, the Han army 5 miles away was dressed in uniform, and their soldiers' faces were filled with fighting spirit and killing intent. Zhou Xian was not a famous general of the Golden Horde, but he had been in the army for many years, and he believed that his eyesight was not bad. After seeing the neat formation of the Han army, he knew that this was not an easy army to deal with. Since last year he had been appointed as the general of Samara city by the Great Khan, in order to prevent the Han people from suddenly crossing this place and appearing at the foot of Sarai city. In other words, his mission did not require him to take the initiative to attack whenever he saw the Han people. He only needed to defend Samara and not lose it. Orders: close the city gates. Everyone is to stand guard on the city walls. Without orders, no one is to attack. After giving up on the idea of clashing with the Han people outside the city, Zhou Xian gave the order to guard the city. Relying on the sturdiness of the city walls, the 20,000 Mongol soldiers and 30,000 slave soldiers looked at the Han Chinese troops with mocking gazes, as if saying, "Come and attack if you have the ability." Truly shameless. The face of the Mongolian warriors has been thrown away by these people. The sergeant put down the binoculars in his hand as he rode on his horse. His face was a little red, but no one knew whether it was because of his anger or because of the wind. Once upon a time, the Mongol cavalry ruled the world and were invincible. They had always been the ones attacking. When had they ever seen them defending the city? But now the tables had turned. It was their turn to guard the city like cowards and not come out, and they still had the face to laugh at others. No matter what, Zhou Xian was half Mongol. More importantly, he had lived on the grasslands since he was a child. Relatively speaking, he was more like a Mongol than a Han. It was because of this that he had such a strong sense of immersion and looked down on the performance of these Mongol people. Beta Persei, who was also riding a horse, saw Zhou Xian's angry snort. He chuckled. It was rare to see Zhou Xian, who was wise and did not show his emotions, so angry. He felt that it was a little funny, but he was more excited about the upcoming siege. He thought that it was time for the field artillery to show its power. He heard that in this winter a lot of artillery shells had been shipped. If they could fire enough, he would not be able to resist. After laughing, he looked at Yang Chendong with a pleading gaze. "Young master, the artillery, go go." Yang Chendong seemed to have known that Beta Persei would make a request. Unlike the other generals, this man had always been busy following him around. Sometimes, it was inevitable that he would lose some freedom. This time he would give the command of the artillery to him. It could be considered a form of compensation. "Understood," Beta Persei responded loudly as if he had become a different person. Then he turned his horse and left. The last time he asked Yang Chendong, he had a chance to fight Gray one-on-one. Now he asked him again and he got the chance to command the artillery. He felt that the young master was really good to him. Of course he would not go overboard. He still had a sense of propriety. He knew when to speak, what kind of things he could participate in and what kind of things he could not touch. Speaking of Gray, he was riding a horse not far behind Yang Chendong. After he was defeated by Beta Persei fair and square, he joined the 5-star army as a captive. Because they were going to deal with the Golden Horde this time, they needed someone who understood the other party very well. Therefore Yang Chendong ordered him to follow the main army. "Even after suffering such a loss, I still treated you as a brave warrior, and even burned incense for you every day. Who would have thought that you would actually surrender to the Han people? Do you know what the word shame means?" Just as he was about to explode with anger, Zhou Xian shouted out loudly, or rather questioned Gray. "Brother Zhou Xian, you are wrong. It's not that I want to surrender to the Han army. It's just that their firepower is too strong. We are no match for them. Brother Zhou Xian, I advise you to open the city gate and surrender to the 5-star army. You are no match for them. Furthermore, the Great Khan has arranged for you to be here. It's obvious that he wants you to be a shield. We can't be rash and lose the lives of our brothers." Gray's relationship with Zhou Xian was very good. Otherwise, Zhou Xian would not have burned incense for him every day. Because of this, he felt that it was even more important to persuade Zhou Xian to open the city gate and surrender. Only then would he be able to survive. He had not seen the power of the 5-star army and still treated Yang Chendong's army as the cowardly 2-legged sheep army of the Han army. How could Zhou Xian surrender without a fight? He knew that the Great Khan had arranged for him to be in Samara City and that he was being used. However, as a Mongolian warrior he should not be afraid of sacrifice or death. Furthermore, wasn't this using him to prove that he was still useful? This was a good job that some warriors were envious of but could not obtain. Zhou Xian, who had made up his mind to defend Samara City to the death and give the Han army a taste of their own medicine, would not give up on defending the city just because of a few words from Gray. Zhou Xian gave a cold snort as he received a powerful crossbow from one of his bodyguards. Pulling the bowstring, he released an arrow, sending an arrow flying 10 steps in front of Gray. Gray. Gray's eyes widened as he looked at Zhou Xian. Gray's eyes widened in shock. Gray, you coward. From now on we have nothing to do with each other. If you continue to stir up the morale of the troops here, the next arrow will be shot into your chest. Zhou Xian was furious as he shouted out emotionlessly. It was impossible for the furious Zhou Xian to listen to any words or advice. Therefore, Gray knew that he wouldn't be able to complete his mission. He was also clear about Zhou Xian's temper. If he didn't leave, the other party would really do as he said and could really kill him with a single arrow. After shaking his head and sighing helplessly, Gray turned his horse back. However, even so, he did not forget to turn around and shout at the city wall. Brothers, remember my words. If you can't hold on, come out with the white flag. At that time I will be able to save your lives. Chapter 1437. After saying those words, Gray did not hesitate any longer. He turned around and walked toward the 5-star army camp behind him. He had said what he needed to say. Now it was time to show his true strength. Gray returned without achieving anything. Yang Chendong saw this scene. He also knew that some enemies were stubborn. If he did not show them some power, they would not listen to him. Pass down the order. Aim the cannons and fire with all your might. Ba Daojiang took Beta Persei's place and shouted loudly, "The king has given the order. Prepare the cannons and fire." After the military order was given, Beta Persei, who was already standing with the artillery battalion, laughed heartily when he heard it. Just now he was really worried that Gray would succeed in persuading them to surrender. If that was the case, wouldn't he be useless? Now it was finally time to show off. He immediately said to Lin Luan, the commander of the artillery battalion of the 2nd Cold Front Division, "Battalion Commander Lin, the next step will depend on our performance. In a while you and I will each take a cannon. Let's see who can shoot more accurately, okay? Hey, but I've won. Second brother, please don't give me a hard time." Lin Luan also laughed happily. In terms of other things he might not be a match for Beta Persei, the favorite of the 6th young master, but in terms of accuracy he was not afraid of anyone. "It's all true. Second brother, I am not a person who can afford to lose. It's just that we haven't started yet. Who knows who will win or lose?" Beta Persei also laughed heroically. Then he walked in front of a cannon and took the initiative to take on the role of the cannoneer. Everything was ready. Beta Persei put a burst shell into the field cannon. With a loud bang, the bombardment of Samara City officially began. The sound of the cannons rumbled like thunder from the heavens. The loud explosions shook one's soul. With each explosion, a cannonball would fly towards the walls of Samara with a deafening roar. Boom. At the same time, a huge hole was left on the city walls and the cannonballs exploded. Countless metal shards and steel nails flew in all directions, landing on the Mongolian soldiers around them, and waves of anguished cries rang out. Blossom bullets were not comparable to solid bullets. The latter could only hit a path while the former could deal secondary damage. Since they were not prepared and did not expect the 5-star army's cannons to be able to hit so far away, their power was also so strong. With just the first round of cannon fire, thousands of Mongolian soldiers were hit and fell to the ground. With 200 cannons, even if each cannonball only injured 5 people, it would still be enough to wipe out 1,000 enemies. In fact, the power of one shot was not limited to this. If the shot was accurate and landed in the midst of the enemy soldiers, it could injure dozens or even hundreds of people. The cannons continued to fire. One of the benefits of the field artillery was that the cost of the artillery shells was reduced, so they could be used more often. The destructive power of the artillery shells would accumulate and the damage would be greater. Under the continuous cannon fire, the city walls of Samara City looked like hell on earth. More and more Mongolian soldiers fell to the ground and more injured soldiers appeared. The morale of the soldiers also became lower and lower under the continuous cannon fire. Under the protection of a group of personal guards, Zhou Xian was pressed to the ground and could not move at all. In just a short quarter of an hour he had witnessed with his own eyes the scene of many brave warriors being killed by the cannons. Those were all warriors who were skilled in archery and horse riding. If they were given a war horse and galloped on the grasslands, even 3 to 5 Han soldiers would not be their match. But now they had died on the city walls in such a sullen manner. This made him feel very uncomfortable. He could not continue to wait like this. He had to take the initiative to attack. Even if he lost the city, it was better than dying in such a cowardly manner. There was a voice shouting in his heart. Zhou Xian didn't know where he got the strength from, but he suddenly pushed off the bodyguards who were on top of him. He shouted loudly, "Warriors, follow this general downstairs. We will ride our war horses and charge out. Even if we die, we will die on the charge. That's right, we must let the Han know our strength." Some of the Mongolian soldiers who could not stand waiting passively to die also shouted out. After the news spread, more and more Mongolian warriors ran down the city walls and found their war horses. They were prepared to charge out and fight. In the 5-star Army's central tent, Yang Qindong put down the binoculars in his hands and raised his right hand. At that moment the battlefield, which was still filled with the sound of cannons, quickly regained its calmness. The sudden silence made some people feel uncomfortable. Just when everyone did not know what had happened, the tightly shut gates of Samara City suddenly opened from the inside. Following that, a large number of Mongolian cavalry surged out. They did not even wait to get into formation and charged towards the 5-star Army's main camp. Yang Qindong had noticed that there were no longer any Mongolian soldiers on the city walls, which was why he had stopped the cannon fire. Now it seemed like he had saved a lot of cannons. However, since the Mongolian soldiers wanted to use cavalry to charge at him, they would have to pay the price for underestimating him. 6th Young Master New Second Army requests for battle. My King White Russia requests for battle. Shibi and Ahuli cupped their fists and walked out. After sweeping his gaze across the two of them, Yang Qindong's gaze landed on the former commander of Lung Feng's 2nd Division, Xiao Feng. I'll leave this battle to Lung Feng. Do not disappoint. Yes, 6th Young Master, don't worry. Xiao Feng chuckled and looked at Shibi and Ahuli with a provocative gaze. He then rode his horse forward and arrived in front of Lung Feng's 2 divisions, who had already gotten into formation and were ready to attack. 6th Young Master has given the order. It's time for us to perform. Remember, hit hard. This is a live target practice. We have to record the results later. There were no words of encouragement. Just the words of recording the results made all the soldiers of Lung Feng's expression turn serious. Lung Feng's treatment was the best in the entire 5-star Army, and they were respected. But at the same time, due to the limited number of spots, if he wanted to secure this position and not be coveted by others, he would need to perform better. The battlefield test was one of the most important criteria. If they performed well, it would not be hard for them to be promoted to officer. If they did not perform well, there were cases of officers being demoted to soldier. It was time to get serious. All the soldiers checked their equipment seriously. Once they did all that, the Mongolian cavaliers across them were only 1 mile away from them. At this moment, Zhou Xian, who was leading the charge, had a smile on his face. Originally, he was already prepared to die. He was also prepared to be bombarded the moment he left the city. If that happened, the formation of his cavalry would be messed up. After all, war horses were extremely afraid of the sound of cannons. He thought that under the sound of the cannons, there would be less than 20% of the soldiers who could charge to the front. However, no one dared to stop them. Could it be that the Han army is afraid? If he knew that this would happen, he would not have needed to defend the city. He would have just led his troops to charge out. That way, the thousands of brothers who had died on the city walls would be a huge fighting force. He sighed and thought that he had overestimated the Han army. At this moment, he only wanted to charge into the Han camp and start a crazy massacre. For this, he continued to spur the war horse under him. Its speed became faster and faster, and they were getting closer and closer to the sandbag formation of the Lung Feng 2 division. 300 steps, fire. Standing beside the group of warriors, Xiao Feng held a Type 95 handgun and shouted loudly. He took the lead to aim the gun at the Mongolian cavalry general Zhou Xian, who was charging over. As the saying goes, soldier against soldier, general against general. This time Xiao Feng's target was Zhou Xian. Following the sound of the gunshot, the bullet shot out rapidly, heading straight for Zhou Xian, who was brandishing his saber. Completely unaware of the approaching danger, Zhou Xian, who was still brandishing his large blade, felt his body sink. It was as if something had drilled into his body. Following which, all the strength in his body started to drain away. Relying on inertia, he continued to charge forward for another 10 meters. Finally, all the strength in his body was used up. His hands no longer had the strength to hold on to the reins of the horse. His body swayed and fell off the horse. A shot to the heart. Zhou Xian's death could be considered a quick one. Just like how the Han people faced the invasion of other races, the Mongols had General Gray, who knew the situation and was afraid of death. There was also General Zhou Xian, who would rather die than submit. This was human nature. It was because everyone's human nature was different that it created such a colorful society. Along with Zhou Xian, there were also hundreds and thousands of Mongol cavalry soldiers. They were all hit by the high-speed bullets while they were moving, causing them to fall off their horses one by one. This scene was just the beginning. As more and more Mongol cavalry soldiers charged forward, more and more people died in the path of the charge. They became ghosts under the spears and went to meet the longevity god that they believed in. Gunshots continued to ring out. No one knew how many waves of bullets were fired. When the battlefield was filled with ownerless warhorses, the Mongol cavalry finally felt fear. There was a limit to a person's courage. When the scene of death appeared in front of them, they might be able to hold on for a while. However, they definitely could not say that they were not afraid. When they saw countless of their comrades mysteriously dying on their horses and not a single one of them being able to charge within 50 meters of the Han army, a feeling of being unable to see any hope filled their entire bodies. At this moment, the fear that was forcefully suppressed continued to surge forth. In the end, it became a sign of collapse. The generals have all died in battle. We can't charge forward. Let's retreat. No one knew who was the first to shout out those words. Following which, the group of Mongol cavalry instinctively urged their horses to turn around. However, it was at this moment that the cannon fire that had stopped started once again. However, this time the cannon fire was not aimed at the city walls. Instead, it was aimed at their escape route. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.